Well, good morning, Grace Fellowship. We're so glad that you're here as we kick off this series, The Problem of God. Before we get into that, I want to thank all of you who volunteered last weekend to make Easter so effective and successful. You are the heroes of that. We had about almost 1,300 people walk through the doors last weekend for Easter. We had 80 spiritual decisions, and so it was a great time, and it continues on today as we start this series. If you made a spiritual decision last week, one of those might have been baptism, and we want to encourage you, if not, if that is your next step, to consider that. In the very next service at 11 o'clock, we're having a class to answer your questions about that. But we immerse believers here at Grace Fellowship. We dunk them underwater, which is kind of a strange thing because that's why you got thrown out of the public pool, right? But anyway, there is something spiritually significant about taking that step. We just celebrated communion, and we celebrate baptism as an expression of our faith in what Jesus did for us. And so it's a very humbling and submissive thing to kneel before your Creator, Redeemer in an act of baptism. And so if that is your step, you can attend the class next hour or check on your connection card your interest in that, and we'll give you all the information you need to make that step. So we are starting this series this morning, The Problem of God. Many of you in this room, when it comes to the biggest questions and challenges of life, believe that God is the solution, not the problem. But you do have people in your life, people that you know and care about, who struggle with issues of God, who have questions about God, and actually consider God in many respects to be the problem. And this really has a little to do with intelligence. I mean, there are very smart people in this world who argue against the existence of God and do so persuasively. There are people, but on the other end, there are some very intelligent people who argue for the existence of God and do so very persuasively. So this is where we need to start, friends. People of faith cannot prove the existence of God beyond any shadow of doubt. But skeptics, or people who would reject that, also have to admit that they cannot disprove the existence of God beyond any shadow of doubt. So the issue really comes down to, what about the evidence? Where does the evidence lead us? What evidence do we have about the existence of God? And does this evidence, is this evidence rational? Is this evidence compelling? Does it make more sense to believe in God than it does to not believe in God? When you consider the arguments for or against God's existence, which position is more rational, more compelling? We find this in the Bible, Romans chapter 1. Paul said, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, which is kind of an interesting statement. I mean, he considers the knowledge of God to be somewhat simple, and here's why, verse 20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, this statement kind of sounds contradictory, right? God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen. How can something invisible be observable, can be seen? And yet, many of you in this room understand that. You believe in a spiritual God, in a spiritual realm, and he is just as real to you as anything that science has ever tested or measured. But that's not enough for your secular friends. As I said, we don't have sufficient proof of God's existence, but we do have, friends, sufficient evidence for God's existence, indicators or clues, and where does that evidence lead us? Okay, so let's talk about the case for God. I can remember having a conversation with both of my children when they were younger about, kids they're full of all kinds of questions, right? They're asking all kinds of questions that we can't answer. Where is God? What does he look like? Where did he come from? Who made him? Who's his mom? And so I can remember having conversations with my kids about God and trying to answer some of those questions. And I would ask them, do you believe in God? And they'd be coloring and playing with toys or busy on the living room floor. And they would stop, both of them, they would stop and they would think, And both of them ask me, well, do you believe in God, Daddy? And Daddy would say, yes, I believe in God. And then they thought, okay, well, then I believe in God too. And they would go back to their coloring book and they're playing things. And, some of you think that that's a really cute story, but some people, that's actually a turnoff because that's been the problem for them. I mean, we just kind of buy this stuff that we've been told. People believe in God because they've been taught to believe in God. What evidence or what argument do they have in this? And we all know that that's not a good life strategy, right? To operate through this world. You don't just buy everything that anybody has ever told you. I mean, if you did that, you'd be overinsured and making payments on a vacuum cleaner you can't afford, right? I mean, you want some evidence. You want an argument for believing what you. I don't want my children, or for any of you for that matter, to believe in God or anything spiritual or biblical just because I told you or anybody else told you to do that. But I do want you to consider the evidence. I do want to show you this morning that the evidence for God is reasonable, it is rational, and it is compelling, and that it does matter to us. So there was one point in the life of Jesus when he turned to his listeners and he said, you know what, the core purpose of your life is to love God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your soul, who you are. And for many of us, that's what church does for you. You come in here, it feeds the emotional side of you. You feel good about yourself. You feel good about your world. You're ready to take on another week of life. And so you walk out of this building and then you put your brain back into your head and you operate in the real world. But you know this verse doesn't end here, right? Many of you. Jesus called us to love him with all of your mind. In other words, Jesus calls us to critical thinking. He encourages us to ask questions. He challenges us to deal with our doubts. One of the reasons why I believe the Bible is because the Bible doesn't edit any of those struggles out. I mean, we just celebrated Easter last weekend. You know what? The Bible actually records the followers of Jesus doubting the reality of the resurrection. They weren't sure. One of them even got nicknamed the doubter. And here's the friends, questions are important. Doubt is a significant part of your faith journey because when you work through the process of doubt, it helps you to arrive at your convictions. I've had many conversations with some of you where you struggle with your struggle. I mean, you kind of feel guilty because you do have questions, because you don't have everything nailed down, and you don't think that that's right. But friends, here's the deal. If you never questioned your faith, you would never own your faith. And if you don't own your faith, you will surrender your faith when that faith gets challenged. You need to walk the journey of honest doubt because doubt keeps us humble. It keeps us hungry for truth. And so when you work through that honest doubt, it leads you to the conviction that builds a strong foundation in your life. It builds authenticity in your life. So here's my challenge to anybody who would be listening to this series. When it comes to God or any issue regarding faith, don't just latch on to any argument that makes you feel good or supports what you want to be true. You owe it to yourself to give faith an honest investigation and then answer the question, where does this evidence lead me? What do I need to do with what I now know? Which argument makes more sense? Okay, so we're going to look at 4 arguments for the existence of God this morning. 2 of them are scientific reasons based in physics, and 2 of them are metaphysical arguments, philosophical arguments, if you will, questions that science cannot answer. And that's another thing before we get into the outline, friends. We live in a science-centric culture where people don't want to believe anything that cannot be scientifically proven. If science doesn't prove it, then it doesn't exist, and I'm not going to believe in it. The thing is, friends, think about it. You don't live that way. None of us live that way. We have questions beyond the physical, beyond the material, issues of purpose and meaning, the world of emotion. Friends, science cannot measure love. Does anybody believe that love exists? You know, so science is good. Science is awesome. The Bible is not afraid of science. It's not opposed to science. The Bible is not a scientific book, but it has science in it. But here's the deal, friends. Science explains the physical. It does not explain the metaphysical. It can tell us the what and the how, but it cannot tell us the why. It can show us the method, but it cannot show us the meaning. And so again, given the evidence, what can we know? What do we know about the universe? And how does that speak for or against the existence of God? Why do I believe that God exists? Here's the reasons. Number 1, I believe God exists because the universe exists. Because you exist. You and I mean, you're here. right? Raise your hand if you're here. Anybody here? Okay, we're all here, which meant somebody had to be here before you got here. We know that, right? Your parents were here before you, and their parents before them, and so on and so on and so on until we run out of so-ons, okay? And that's the issue. Every scientist would agree that everything that exists had to have a cause, a reason why it exists. And so you work your way backwards to what we call the uncaused cause. And for hundreds of years, both scientists and theologians both accepted the premise that the universe was the eternal uncaused cause, that the universe always existed, which was a fine position to hold until about 1929, when Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe was actually moving and expanding at an incredible rate. Based on his research, we learned that the universe is vaster than anyone had ever imagined before, and further scientific study concluded that this vast universe, the galaxies, were traveling at incredible speeds, and they were moving apart from one another because they had been flung apart by a massive explosion. Every scientist asserts this at this point, and all of this discovery was telling us, showing us that the galaxies and the planets and the stars and the energy, all of the matter in the universe had a common point of origin. It all started somewhere. You've heard of the Big Bang Theory. It's not just a silly show on TV, friends. It's probably the most significant scientific discovery over the last century. Because the argument, which everyone agrees to, is whatever begins to exist had to have a cause. And so now we've discovered that the universe began to exist, therefore, what caused the universe? No modern scientist disputes this argument. And you couple that with the second law of thermodynamics, which argues that there is a limited amount of energy in the universe. Friends, our universe is like a flashlight running on batteries. At one point, it's going to run out of energy. It's coming toward an end, what's interesting is that when these discoveries were made, it was the scientific world that pushed against this. The Big Bang idea actually destroyed the eternal universe concept, which secular scientists believed in. There must be a cause behind the universe, behind the physical, behind the material world. And here's what's important. The Bible has never disputed that. The Bible has never told us otherwise. In fact, the Bible kind of explains to us what the Big Bang might have been. The Big Bang presents no problem for the Christian worldview. But on the other side of that, if you reject the idea of God, then this discovery presents a rather inconvenient truth. The Christian worldview would say that there is an infinite, eternal God outside of matter, outside of the physical world, who spoke the universe into existence. We call it ex nihilo, something out of nothing. And if you want to reject that, then you have a real problem, because everyone agrees that you can't get something out of nothing. And without God, that's what you have. You have nothing. You have no explanation. You have no source. You have no origin. Parents, this is not like the jelly stain on your carpet, which your kids told you miraculously showed up. Okay? Something had to have happened for all of this to take place. There really is a reason why the universe exists. And we believe that God exists because the universe exists. Here's the second reason: because the universe is perfect. The universe, the scientists call this fine-tuning. Tim Keller calls this the cosmic welcome mat. Scientists and physicists, both secular and religious, refer to this as the anthropic principle, which argues that the universe is so finely tuned that it had to be this way in order to support life as we know it. And there's dozens and dozens of conditions and contingencies in biology and physics that would have to be just right for life to exist in the universe, on this planet. A couple of examples. The proportion of the mass of a neutron of hydrogen that's converted to energy during nuclear fusion is 0.007. Now, you guys already knew that. But what you might not know is that scientists would tell us that if that was 0.006, the whole universe would be hydrogen. And if it were 0.008, there would be no hydrogen, which in either case, there would be no possibility of life on this planet. And that's just one condition. If we were 5%, if Earth was 5% closer to the sun, it would be like 900 degrees on this planet. Now, I've been told that that's a dry heat like Arizona, but still, I mean, 20% further away from the sun, we would be one big ice cube. Olaf wouldn't even like it. I mean, it just wouldn't work. Scientists tell us that we live in the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And friends, there's so much more. The fact that the Earth rotates and is not stationary, the law of gravity, the composition of our atmosphere, the distance of the sun affecting the gravitational pull of the Earth, the size and the distance of our moon, which keeps the ocean tides from washing over the entire continents and keeps our planet tilted to a degree that makes climate possible for life. Water. We couldn't live without water. But water, it's very interesting. When water freezes, it contracts, and when water warms, it expands. And if water did not have that property, then oceans and lakes would freeze from the bottom up, which would make aquatic life impossible. I could go on and on and on and on and on. Consider like a dashboard full of dials, dozens and dozens and dozens of dials that have to be turned at just the right exact point, and all of them in sync together, set perfectly in order for life to exist. A physicist by the name of Freeman Dyson said, "It's as if the universe saw us coming. It was just waiting for us to show up." Now, all of this makes the argument that the probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule. I mean, the chance of this actually happening without some cause behind it is like a blind person solving a Rubik's Cube. I mean, it's just, and we haven't even gotten into DNA yet, which Darwin didn't because he didn't know DNA existed. When he developed the theory of evolution, he started with the first protein molecule, not even understanding that there was so much more information than he constructed this theory and had no idea what he was dealing with because he didn't have the technology to discover the complex, intricate system within that one protein molecule. And so he had no explanation for how that existed or where that came from, how that started, who started it. And again, the Bible's not bothered by that. I mean, the Bible's been telling us for thousands of years that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So that's the science end of it. That's just two scientific reasons. Here, let's talk about some philosophical arguments for existence. We hunger for meaning. Another indicator for God's existence is the fact that you and I, we don't consider ourselves a random collection of chemicals evolving over millions and millions, billions of years, because we long for meaning and worth. For some reason, most of us want to know that we matter. The question is why? I mean, you've never walked into a Hallmark store and picked up a card that says, "I celebrate your composition of carbon. Your random collection of molecules is awesome to behold. Enjoy your time on this insignificant planet before you rot and decay and your momentary existence is eternally unremembered. Happy birthday." I mean, why do we even celebrate birthdays? Why do we celebrate any event in life if all we are at is an accident? I mean, the fact that we hunger for meaning, friends, for worth, proves to us that meaning exists. I mean, it at least begs the question. I mean, we have a hunger for food. It would be strange if food did not exist. We thirst for water. Wouldn't it be a strange world if water did not exist? We have an appetite for sex. It would be a strange universe if no such thing as sexual activity existed. And we hunger for meaning. Why would that be if we existed in a meaningless universe? What makes something comprised only of a random collection of chemicals think that something beyond that composition might exist? Well, maybe because there is something beyond this composition that does exist. We hunger for meaning. And number 4, we believe in morality. We believe in right and wrong. Most of us believe that there's a universal standard by which we should adhere to. If you've ever been in an argument, how many of you have ever been in an argument? This morning, you've been in an argument. Okay, think about this, friends. The fact that you argue, the reality of disagreements support the idea of morality, because what's your premise in any argument? Friends, you argue because you believe that there is a truth, a standard by which to live, and the person you're arguing with is on the wrong side of that standard. It doesn't matter what culture or period of human history you live in. You go back as far as humankind goes. We have always embraced this idea, this sense of justice and equality. And when that standard is violated, we protest the unfairness of it. Homicide, genocide, infanticide, fratricide, any kind of side. In addition to meaning, this is what sets us, the human world, apart from the animal world, the animal kingdom. When a lion kills a zebra, what do we call that? Well, I don't know what we call it, but the lion calls it lunch. And the animal kingdom doesn't protest that. They just try not to be the next victim. But when a human being kills another human being, what do we call that? Murder. We don't call it bad, we call it wrong. And anybody that doesn't agree with that in our culture, we don't call them wrong, we call them sociopaths. Or psychopaths. We call them something wrong with them. Friends, we live in a culture that's all about tolerance and autonomy. I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, I have a truth, you have a truth, everybody has a truth, it's all relative, don't impose your truth on me, your morality on me, I have my own personal preference, friends. It sounds so convenient in theory until someone violates your personal preference. Then all of a sudden there's a right and a wrong that you want people to adhere to. And then you discover that this is really a nonsensical way to live with other human beings. There's got to be a standard. If everything is random, friends, why are we moral creatures? Evolutionary theory or any construct of the universe without God has no explanation for the hunger for justice or a rational defense for morality. The Holocaust? Why would anyone object to that? I mean, it's just survival of the fittest. Rape? So what? It's biological creatures doing what biological creatures do. And yet you don't believe that, do you? None of us believe that. And why don't we believe that? Why do we care about that? You see, you have to consider the evidence before you and think through the logical conclusions of those arguments. Are there people who reject the idea of God, who long for meaning and hunger for justice? Of course there are. No one would suggest that people who reject God don't believe in human dignity and a standard of morality. But we can say this, friends, without God in the equation, if you reject the idea of God, something behind the cause, then all you are is a product of a chemical explosion and an evolutionary process where the weak give way to the strong, which means logically, intellectually, scientifically, you have no rational basis to argue for human worth or justice or morality. None of this really matters. And yet all of us want it to. Let me close with this, because I think I've had conversations over the years, for a lot of years. There's all kinds of people, all kinds of reasons why people reject the existence of a transcendent being. They want to reject the idea of God. And I believe a lot of people, in my experience, one of the most common reasons why people reject the idea of God is not anything scientific or even philosophical. Here's the argument, friends. If there is a higher authority, I have to surrender mine. If there's someone who created me, then I'm accountable to that creation. For a lot of people, the issue is not sufficient evidence, it's personal autonomy or freedom. I don't want to be accountable to a God who created me. But here's what you've got to know. Here's what you need to know, friends. The God of the Bible, the God whom we believe created us, we also believe loves us. He created us for a reason. He created us for a relationship. He created us to love us. He created us to move through this world loving one another. And so I don't know, maybe for you it's not so much believing in the existence of God, but trusting your existence to that creator. And so I just want to encourage you to consider the evidence, follow where it leads, and answer the question for yourself. Is it more rational to believe in God or not? Is it more compelling to acknowledge that a God exists or not? And if he does, what should I do about that? If you have questions about that this morning, that's why I'm here. I'd love to discuss anything that you have going on in your mind or heart. I want to help you to take that next step in your understanding of the God who created you and loves you. Many of you, I'm preaching to the choir, but you have people in your life who are struggling, who are questioning, who are skeptical, who don't believe. And so I hope this series will help build a foundation for you to have a credible and confident conversation with them about the God who created them and loves them. Would you pray with me? Father, we do thank you for you revealing yourself to us. For many of us, it can be clearly seen. But Father, help us to understand in those areas where we doubt and struggle. Father, continue to reveal to us your truth and your existence so that we might know you and love you the way you love us. Bless our gifts and our offerings, Father, as we continue in the service. In Jesus' name, amen.